My God, they all stopped for him? The stunned exclamation rang out along Orange Avenue, where a Navy SEALs parade had suddenly come to a standstill before an unknown man. In a rusted wheelchair, he sat upright, eyes gazing into the distance, his hand gripping a small American flag. No one in the town of Coronado had ever heard him speak of his past. To them, he was simply a peculiar old veteran. But today, as the entire SEAL unit bowed in salute to him, a searing question arose. What had he sacrificed to be worthy of such respect? His name was Daniel Hayes. In the town of Coronado, where every street bore the footprints of Navy SEALs, he was nearly invisible. People called him with casual indifference, Old Dan down the street, a quiet old man in a battered wheelchair, living in a weathered wooden house facing the harbor. Its porch always streaked with bird droppings and corners piled high with old radios. Each day, he wheeled himself out to scatter millet seeds for the sparrows, then silently rolled back inside. That life so simple it bordered on dull over the years had turned him into little more than a shadow in the eyes of the town. Daniel never joined block parties, nor did he attend veterans' gatherings. On Memorial Days he stood at a distance, on the fringe of the crowd, never among the ranks. Sometimes people spotted him at church, always choosing the last pew, slipping out before the final hymn. No one truly spoke with him. Replies were usually just a thin smile or a distracted nod. To children, he was the strange, quiet old man. To adults, he was someone hidden away, perhaps clinging to a past that wasn't worth remembering. But that Memorial Day morning, everything changed. Daniel did not wear his usual gray sweater, but instead his old Navy uniform, the blue faded with age, shoulder seams frayed, yet pressed neat and sharp. His shoes were polished, buttons fastened with care. Though his shoulders had bent with age, his spine remained straight, like a habit that never left him. He positioned himself at the end of Orange Avenue, the street where the parade would pass, and turned back and sat there, silent, like a witness. The crowd hardly noticed him. People were busy cheering, waving small flags, filming with their phones. Children giggled, chasing after candy tossed from floats. A few glanced at Daniel, then looked away, thinking he was just another veteran, showing up on the holiday to remind himself he still existed. But no one knew that for Daniel, today was not about proving anything, it was about saying goodbye. When the brass music swelled, the Navy SEAL formation appeared, 48 men, uniforms crisp, ranks aligned perfectly. Their steps were powerful, decisive, pounding the pavement like a heartbeat. The crowd cheered louder, phones raised higher. But then, something unexpected happened. The commander raised his hand. The entire SEAL formation froze. The music stopped. The noise evaporated. The whole street sank into silence. The commander broke ranks, crossed the street, and walked straight toward the old man in the wheelchair. In that moment, every eye turned to Daniel Hayes. The man the town had overlooked for years was suddenly the focus of thousands of hearts holding their breath. He sat there, hands trembling on his lap, eyes distant yet sharp. A strange contrast appeared before everyone. A frail old man commanding the halt of the Navy's most elite warriors. In the crowd, Samantha Reed, the only neighbor with any connection to Daniel, was stunned. She had been the one to bring him here this morning. She remembered a few days earlier, when he knocked on her door for the first time, holding a small American flag. His voice was shaky but resolute. "This Sunday, could you take me to see the parade?" She had nodded, not daring to ask more. Now, watching this unfold, she understood. He hadn't come to watch, he had come to say farewell. Coronado held its breath. Someone whispered, "Who is he?" Another answered, "He must have been a SEAL, but why do they know him?" Questions spilled into the silence. And at that moment, everyone realized the answer would not be ordinary. Because something had made Daniel Hayes the man who had lived like a shadow into the very center of an entire town. "All right, Dear viewers, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly resonate with what I've shared. And leave a comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from across the world. A few days before the parade, something rare happened. Daniel Hayes knocked on his neighbor's door. The knock was soft, patient, but to Samantha Reed, a grade school teacher who had moved in only a few years earlier, it was a sound that surprised her. In all the time they had lived side by side, old Dan had never once reached out. People often joked that it would take a miracle to get him to say more than a word. Samantha opened the door, already braced to hear some complaint about the children who so often sent their soccer ball crashing against his fence. But the sight before her stopped her short. Daniel stood there, back straight despite his gaunt frame, silver hair lit by the evening sun, his trembling hand holding a neatly folded American flag. There was no irritation in his face, only a solemn gravity she couldn't quite name. He held the flag out, his voice so faint it was nearly swallowed by the breeze. He wanted her to drive him to see the parade. Just a simple request. Yet in those aged eyes, Samantha saw more an affirmation. A decision long made, not a casual favor. She nodded immediately, asked no questions, but felt a weight settle in her chest, a sense that this meant far more than his words revealed. In the days that followed, she noticed his lights burning later than usual. Through the window, she could see Daniel's thin silhouette in the small room, sometimes seated at his desk, sometimes carefully bringing out an old Navy uniform, brushing at each stain with a soft brush. The fabric was faded, buttons loose, but the way he handled it was like a sacred ritual. She found herself smiling faintly when she saw him bent over with the old iron, as if he were a cadet preparing for graduation. There was seriousness in it, but also an endearing awkwardness. He never spoke of his health. He didn't mention the mounting pain in his chest, nor did he share the cold verdict the doctor had given him. 2 months left. For Daniel, that was unnecessary. He wanted no pity from neighbors, no comfort from friends if any remained. He chose silence, just as he had lived most of his life. Only once did he allow himself a small admission. When Samantha brought him a warm meal and urged him to rest, Daniel left her with a single sentence. "This means a great deal to me. Nothing more, nothing less." She understood he was speaking about the parade. Inside his weathered house, small details hinted at the man he truly was. There were no medals on the shelves, no framed commendations. Instead, a few worn photographs, many turned face down as if deliberately hidden. One, left exposed, showed a young man in a Navy uniform, half smiling, surrounded by a few hard-edged faces of his comrades. No captions, no polished frame, just left there like a memory someone had tried to forget. And then there was the detail that haunted Samantha, a small wooden box on the table. Inside lay an old dagger, the handle faintly carved with 3 letters. Hey. She didn't need anyone to explain. This was no decoration. It was history. No ordinary man would keep such a relic. All of it felt like scattered clues, but enough to suggest that Daniel was more than the lonely old man he appeared to be. Beneath the silence lay endurance, discipline that never left him, and a story no one had heard. On those afternoons when he sat on the porch, he still carried that rigid bearing. A child once dared to ask if he had been a soldier. He only smiled, waved the question away, and turned aside. But the avoidance felt less like denial and more like protection, shielding others from memories he refused to let them bear. Samantha didn't know the whole truth. The town didn't either. But one thing was certain. This man was not ordinary. And when he asked to be taken to Main Street on Memorial Day, it wasn't just a casual outing. It felt like a final journey. The question hung heavy in the air. If a man had chosen silence his entire life, what could possibly drive him to want to see, one last time, on that day in that crowd in Coronado. 70 years ago, Daniel Hayes was not an old man in a wheelchair in a weathered wooden house in Coronado. He had once been a tall, wiry, stubborn young man, full of ambition, raised on the windblown fields of Kansas. At 18, he signed his name on the Navy enlistment papers. For Daniel, it wasn't a choice, it was almost a calling from within. Only a few months later, when the chance came, he volunteered immediately for the SEALs, a unit just formed, but already notorious for its hellish training on the sands of Coronado, where cold surf pounded into bodies until minds went numb. Back then, Daniel was known as a quiet but obstinate figure. While many recruits secretly wished for rain to ease the intensity of training, the boy from Kansas had a habit of smirking and saying, "At least the mud covers the smell of sweat." That dry humor earned him the nickname Dry Dan for both his reserved nature and the way he tossed out lines that made others laugh, even though he never laughed himself. But behind the calm exterior, he revealed an iron will, the kind that carried him through bid S when so many others rang out. In 1968, the Vietnam War was at its fiercest. Daniel was sent to the Mekong Delta, where winding rivers twisted like a maze and mud swallowed men like a natural trap. Nights in the jungle were thick with mosquitoes like smoke, and above all, death stalked every step. With his SEAL team, he carried out mission after mission raids, hostage rescues, covert strikes. On some nights, gunfire crashed like thunder, and by dawn, familiar faces were gone forever. But one night carved itself into his memory for the rest of his life. The unit was ambushed in a mangrove swamp, darkness split open with tracer rounds, shouts and chaos echoing everywhere. Mud flew, water splashed into faces. In that maelstrom, Lieutenant Michael Donovan, the young commander, was pinned down under heavy fire. And Rivera, Daniel's closest friend, took 2 rounds to the chest and collapsed. That was the moment most men would retreat, find cover, wait for support. Most of the unit did just that, but Daniel did not. In the rain of bullets, he charged back, knelt to drag Donovan out of danger. Then, without stopping, he hoisted Rivera over his shoulders, carrying the blood-soaked weight, and began trudging across nearly 500 yards of sucking swamp mud. Bullets ripped the air, dirt and water exploded, the stench of gunpowder mingled with sweat and mire, but Daniel never stopped, each step heavy as iron, yet always forward. Rivera died on his shoulders before they broke the perimeter. Donovan lived, and from that night on, Daniel's fate was bound to a bitter truth. He saved his commander but lost his best friend. When the operation ended, Donovan was rushed to treatment, while Daniel sat for hours beside Rivera's body, silent as stone. Later, they tried to award him a medal, a certificate, a ceremony, speeches that thundered. Daniel refused it all. He said simply, "I only did what a SEAL is supposed to do." No boasting, no retelling. To him, Rivera's death on his shoulders could never be balanced by a piece of metal. And so, when the war ended, Daniel walked away. No ceremonies, no honors, no story shared with anyone. To the world, he disappeared from the spotlight. But in Daniel's mind, Rivera, the friend with the wide grin and the off-key singing during long nights, never left. Sometimes, alone in his small house in Coronado, he turned on the radio to old songs. If anyone had watched closely, they'd see him pause when a melody came that Rivera once hummed. A smile flickered, only to fade quickly, replaced by that faraway stare as if he were still watching someone in another place. That story, no one in town ever knew. Not neighbors, not friends, not a single article. Only Daniel and the memory, sealed in silence. And it was that memory that brought him to the end of Orange Avenue on Memorial Day, sitting there as a witness of an entire generation. But what Coronado did not yet know was this. That memory did not only shape Daniel's life, it had also left an unshakable mark on the men he had saved. And sometimes, debts of life can wait half a century to be repaid. Dear viewers, take a sip of water and stay with the story. The most unexpected moments are yet to come. Comment 1 if you're still here with us. That noon, exactly at 12 o'clock, Coronado moved into the familiar rhythm of Memorial Day. Orange Avenue was draped in flags, music drifted from the high school band, even if the brass occasionally faltered and a few boys could hardly hide their excitement at being handed the drums. Cheers stretched down the street as floats covered in paper flowers rolled by in bright colors. Everything unfolded as it did every year, a small town paying its tribute on a day of remembrance. Sitting at the far edge of the street, Daniel Hayes watched in silence. He did not wave a flag, nor did he smile. Only his weary eyes followed each passing group. From his vantage point, he saw it all. The last surviving World War II veterans shuffling forward, local associations marching with pride, children waving ceaselessly. Part of him felt out of place, but another part, deep within, knew he belonged here more than anyone. When the Navy SEALs appeared, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Dark blue uniforms pressed sharp, footsteps firm, formation seamless. The crowd hushed for a few seconds, then erupted in applause and cheers. For Coronado, the cradle of the SEALs, this moment was always the heartbeat of the parade. Daniel sat motionless. The sounds around him seemed to recede. In that instant, memory returned. Hurried footsteps in the jungles of Vietnam, the ragged breaths of teammates, Rivera's face collapsing against his shoulder. He blinked, grounding himself back in the present, but his heart raced faster. And then the unexpected happened. The commander at the front raised his hand. The 48 SEALs halted at once, boots striking the pavement in a single resounding beat, sharp and final. The festive noise collapsed into silence. The band faltered, a few musicians missing their notes. The crowd murmured, whispers rising. What's happening? Why are they stopping? Eyes began searching for the cause, and then, as if led by an invisible thread, they all settled on the old man in the wheelchair. The commander stepped out of formation, striding down the center of the street. He was tall, his hair touched with gray, his gait confident. In the sea breeze, his name echoed in the minds of a few older onlookers, Captain Andrew Donovan. Many recognized him, one of the veteran SEAL officers of the present generation, often seen in military journals. But what stunned them more was his destination, the wheelchair of Daniel Hayes. Donovan stopped, stood tall, and looked directly at the frail old man before him. A moment of silence, then his voice rang clear, cutting through the wind and the murmurs of the crowd. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Hayes, you are not forgotten. The words dropped onto the street like a heavy hammer, freezing the air. The entire crowd was stunned. Samantha Reed, standing across the way, instinctively raised a hand to her mouth. She had never once heard the title Chief Petty Officer attached to her quiet neighbor, Old Dan. Now she understood why he had begged to come to the parade one last time. Daniel trembled. His eyes widened, glistening as if reflecting a lifetime of memory. He said nothing, but his breathing quickened, as though decades of silence had been pulled into the open with a single sentence. Behind Donovan, the SEAL formation remained frozen. No one moved, no gaze strayed from the sight of the man in the wheelchair. The crowd murmured, confused. Someone whispered, "Who is he?" Another replied softly, "Was he a SEAL?" But then silence spread, because the truth was already undeniable. The most elite warriors of the United States had stopped to honor a man the town had long treated as invisible. In that moment, Daniel Hayes was no longer a lonely old man. He became a living emblem of memory, of sacrifice, of stories left untold. And in Captain Donovan's blazing eyes, There was more than respect, perhaps a debt, perhaps gratitude, perhaps the memory of a father once carried to safety. The crowd was silent, hearts pounding harder. They did not yet know what would be revealed, but the instinct was unmistakable. This was no ordinary moment in a parade. This was a moment that would be retold for years, not only in Coronado, but perhaps across the nation. A question whispered itself into every mind. What had Daniel Hayes done to make the Navy SEALs halt their entire parade for him? It felt as if the air had been sucked out of the entire street. After the solemn declaration, Captain Andrew Donovan turned to face the crowd. His gaze was sharp as a blade, but his voice was measured, steady, each word deliberate and clear, enough to still even the most restless children. He began to tell the story. He told of a dark night in 1968, when the Vietnam War swallowed the youth of thousands of soldiers. He told of the moment his father, Lieutenant Michael Donovan, lay gravely wounded, awaiting death in a storm of bullets. And he told of a young man named Daniel Hayes who had charged back into the fire, dragged his commander from the kill zone, and then shouldered another comrade, carrying him step by step through mud and gunfire. The words were not embellished, not dramatized, but their weight shook every heart. No one in Coronado had ever heard this story. To them, old Dan was only the gruff man in a wheelchair who sometimes forgot to greet his neighbors. But now that image shattered. Before them stood the truth. A silent hero, one who never demanded recognition, never stepped forward to claim glory, but chose instead to live quietly, swallowing the memories into silence. When Donovan's voice faltered and he paused, silence covered all. The sea breeze swept through, carrying the smell of salt and the rustle of flags, as though even nature itself had stopped to listen. And then came a moment no one expected. The first SEAL in formation broke ranks. He stepped toward the wheelchair, stood at attention, raised his hand in a crisp, perfect salute. His eyes gleamed with emotion. When he lowered his hand, he leaned in, his words barely above a whisper, meant only for Daniel. "Thank you, Chief." There was no applause, no cheers, only solemn silence. Then the second stepped forward. Then the third. One by one, each SEAL in dark blue uniform, polished boots, and hardened face, approached the frail old man, saluted with absolute respect, and whispered the same two words, "Thank you, Chief." With each one, Daniel trembled a little more. His thin hands on his knees shook, his eyes shimmered with unshed tears. No one knew exactly what was running through his mind, but all could feel the weight of 47 years of silence breaking. When the 10th stepped forward, a boy in the crowd whispered to his mother, "Why are they thanking him?" The mother only shook her head, tears streaming down her face. By the 20th, many in town were covering their mouths, emotion rising like waves. By the 30th, the crowd, so often noisy and carefree, stood as still as stone. And then the last one, the 48th, approached. A young SEAL, his face still boyish, perhaps only in his 20s. He saluted sharply, lowered his hand, and whispered, "Thank you, Chief." In that moment, Daniel could no longer hold back. Tears slid down his weathered cheeks, falling onto the faded Navy uniform. His hand shook as he raised it to his brow, returning a slow but complete salute. No words were spoken, but his eyes, bright, clear, glistening like glass, spoke all that needed to be said. Pride, sorrow, and the release of a burden carried in silence for half a century. A wave of emotion surged across Orange Avenue. No chants, no thunderous applause, only a silence so profound one could hear the wind striking the flag. A few elderly men stood straighter, hands pressed to their chests. The children, though they did not fully understand, still felt the sacredness of the moment. Samantha Reed wept. She wept because, for the first time, she realized her quiet neighbor, the grumpy old man, was the very reason dozens of men live today. And not only them, but all the generations that followed. When Daniel lowered his hand, his breath was heavy, but a smile broke across his face. A real smile, the first many in town had ever seen. Not the forced half-smile of deflection, but the smile of a man who had finally been recognized not for glory, but for a truth that could no longer remain buried. That moment was not just the meeting of an old veteran and a younger generation of warriors. It was transformation. From silence to acknowledgement, from shadow to light, from loneliness to belonging. And everyone knew Coronado would never forget this sight. But what they did not yet know was that this tribute was not only for Daniel Hayes. It was the opening of something deeper, a debt that had waited decades to finally be spoken. No one in Coronado could have imagined that a moment thought to be nothing more than an annual parade ritual would become the most unforgettable memory of their lives. When the SEAL formation closed their tribute, the street so accustomed to cheers and noise fell into a solemn silence so profound it seemed to slow the beating of hearts. People no longer waved flags or raised their phones to record. They stood still, as though a single sudden movement might shatter the sanctity of what had just taken place before their eyes. Samantha Reed stood among the crowd, both hands unconsciously pressed against her mouth. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had thought she was simply helping an old neighbor attend the parade. But in truth, she had brought an unsung hero to the day of his final glory. All the times he had remained silent, all the deflecting nods, now they had an explanation. He had never been cold. He was simply a man carrying memories too heavy for anyone else to share. The children of the town who had only ever known old Dan as the grumpy old man at the end of the street tugged on their parents' hands, asking insistently, "Who is he? Why are the SEALs thanking him?" The parents looked at one another, some unable to hold back tears, others whispering, "He's a hero who lived beside us all these years, and we never knew." When the SEALs pulled back into formation and resumed their march, no one in the crowd clapped. There were no cheers, no noise. Heads bowed, the silence itself became a farewell. The entire street transformed into a spontaneous memorial more solemn than any official ceremony ever held. That afternoon, Coronado did not return to its usual rhythm. People walked more slowly, spoke more softly, and looked at one another with new understanding. Some found reasons to pass by the small house at the end of the street, the one they had ignored for so long. For the first time, they did not see a peculiar old man. They saw a fragment of the nation's memory hidden behind weathered wooden doors. As night fell, the sea breeze swept through Coronado. In the small house, a warm yellow light glowed from the window. Daniel Hayes lay still in his old bed. No morphine, no machines, no steady hospital beeps. Only silence, his hand resting lightly on his chest, his breath slowing until it ceased. His Navy uniform still hung neatly by the door, pressed and straight, as it had been that morning when he wore it to the parade. Beside the bed, on a wooden table, was an old photograph he had carefully folded. In it, a young SEAL, caked in mud, held an unseen fallen comrade just outside the frame. No caption, no glass frame, just a simple photo, yet it contained an entire piece of his life. When the news spread the following morning, Coronado was shaken. Local headlines read, "Silent Hero Passes After Final Parade." The video of 48 SEALs saluting him, one after another, spread online at lightning speed. Hundreds of thousands of views, thousands of comments. Veterans from across the country wrote letters. Strangers drove for hours just to lay flowers on the porch of the small house at the end of the street. In that moment, Daniel Hayes, the man who had lived like a shadow, became a symbol of courage without fame, of sacrifice without medals, of memory that could never remain buried forever. Coronado awoke. People realized that sometimes heroes are not the names etched on stone or printed in history books. Sometimes, heroes live right beside us in the form of an old man in a wheelchair, quietly scattering seed for the sparrows each morning. And across this vast nation, perhaps there are many more Daniel Hayes, still silent, still unknown, still unseen. There are heroes who never seek the spotlight, who never boast of the battles they survived. They live quietly among us like Daniel Hayes, with trembling hands scattering seed for the birds on his porch until one day we suddenly realize that their sacrifices have written part of the freedom we enjoy today. His story reminds us that true glory does not lie in medals hung on the wall, but in integrity, in sacrifice, and in dignity carried steadfastly to the very end of life. In today's busy world, perhaps the most important thing we can do is pause to look, to listen, to acknowledge the quiet souls around us. For gratitude not only heals the one who receives it, but also heals our own hearts. If this story has touched you, please leave a comment, share your thoughts, and help spread this message to others. And don't forget to follow the channel so we can continue this journey together, sharing stories of courage, humanity, and the sacrifices of America's silent heroes.
Get down now. The hoarse shout tore through the quiet morning on the Coronado Pier. In the space of a single heartbeat, the group of young SEALs dropped to the deck, bewildered. The one who had yelled was an elderly black man, 68 years old, his hands trembling slightly but his eyes sharp as blades. He pointed toward the ship's eastern hull. "Hear the steel breathing? It's about to give way," they scoffed. 5 minutes later, the hull blew apart exactly where he had pointed. He turned away, quietly picking up an old steel mug lying on the dock. No one knew that mug had been with him through Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan. No one knew that pinned to his chest were two medals they might never see in their entire lives. But they were about to know, and they would never forget. At the SEAL training base in Coronado, where the deep blue sea meets the horizon and sleek black rib boats are always ready to charge into the waves, there was a man everyone saw, but no one truly looked at. Marcus Ellington, 68, was the complete opposite of the shirtless, adrenaline-fueled young recruits out on the field. He didn't sprint under the blazing sun, didn't hang from soaked ropes, didn't shout mottos. Every morning, he simply walked across the training yard, dressed in dark coveralls smudged with engine oil, sea salt-crusted boots on his feet, and in his hand, a battered steel mug he never seemed to part with. On paper, Marcus's job was simple: maintain the equipment, check the boat engines, and occasionally, when asked, teach a few basic maintenance steps for sidearms. He sat more than he stood, listened to the sound of engines more than to the sound of people. To him, the work wasn't loud but required patience. Like talking to a wild animal, the more you rush, the faster it runs. To the 20-something-year-old, muscle-packed men who carried the illusion of invincibility, Marcus was nothing more than the slow old black guy who was lucky to be here for reasons nobody knew. With his name absent from any public SEAL training records, they quietly drew their own conclusions. Probably just logistics staff. Bet he never even made it through Bud, Sess. Those rumors spread faster than the sea breeze. When Marcus walked past, a few low whistles cut through the air, just enough to sting, not enough to be considered outright disrespect. He never reacted, only kept walking, his pace as steady as the soft hum of an engine. Lieutenant Brad Coleman, the 2-year-old training commander with a buzz cut and a permanent pair of sunglasses, as if the Coronado sun were a classified threat, wasn't particularly interested in Marcus's presence either. Once he patted Marcus lightly on the shoulder and said, half polite, half dismissive, "You just stick to the tech bay, Pops. Let the young guys handle the open water." Marcus nodded, offering nothing more. If that comment was a stone tossed into a pond, the water in him remained perfectly still. But Marcus's consistency began to grate on some. Every morning, he arrived on time, quietly opened his tool cabinet, laid out each dive knife on the table, and sharpened them as though he were honing memories. He wiped each gun down as if soothing a sleeping predator. No one understood why he did this for training weapons, not actual combat gear. But he did it day after day. Some said he was just killing time. Others claimed he was trying to prove he was still useful. One young recruit joked, "Maybe he's dating that Glock." Laughter broke out, and as always, Marcus didn't turn his head. What unsettled them more was the way he observed. Even when seated in the corner of the workshop, his eyes occasionally drifted toward the docks, where the young SEALs practiced rope climbs, paddled boats, or leapt into the water from helicopters. He didn't cheer, didn't criticize, just watched, as if comparing a new song to an old melody he knew by heart. Sometimes, passing the training yard, he would pause for a few seconds by the climbing wall, his gaze measuring each anchor point, each rope. Once, a soldier caught him standing at the base of the wall, fingertips lightly brushing over the worn patch on a safety line, a wear mark only someone who had once hung from it would notice, and then he would return to the workshop, resuming his work. No explanation given. Marcus didn't blend into the crowd, but he didn't hide from it either. He existed among them like a shadow present, tangible yet hard to touch. And while they thought he was just a dull background to the base, somewhere deeper a few had begun to sense that something didn't quite add up. Because sometimes the way he looked out to sea wasn't the look of someone standing safely ashore. It was the look of someone who had been in the heart of the waves, who knew exactly how they could swallow everything and had still come back. Would they dare ask what he had seen, or would they cling to the stories they had built for themselves? And more importantly, were they ready to hear the answer?
Welcome to Veteran Hero Medal, where silent scars speak, honor lives on, and real heroes wear no capes.
That afternoon, the San Diego sunlight slanted through the warehouse windows of the training supply depot, golden rays tangled with fine dust hanging in the air. Marcus stood alone at the far end of the shelving, where stacks of mock explosive crates were piled like giant Lego blocks. One of the crates sat slightly askew, its label facing the wrong way, pressing unevenly on the shelf below. Without calling for anyone, he bent down, rotated it, then lifted it out slowly, but with a steadiness that left no doubt. His movements weren't the casual motions of tidying up. They were calculated, precise down to each angle. He set the crate back in its proper place, then adjusted the label so the UP arrow actually pointed up. A petty officer happened to walk by, pausing for a few seconds, eyes narrowing slightly. The way Marcus kept his hands parallel while lifting, braced the load with his forearms, then set it down gently, that was advanced EOD procedure, taught only to counterterrorism, special operations units handling live explosives. None of the young trainees here would recognize it, but the petty officer did. He walked away silently, filing the detail in his mind as a piece of a puzzle that didn't yet fit. A few days later, during a nighttime live-fire drill at the indoor range, the only light came from dim red bulbs and the sharp thwop of rubber rounds hitting targets. A young trainee, in his first low-light shoot, fumbled with his M4 after a jam. Flustered, he yanked the trigger twice in a row, locking the weapon solid. Marcus, then at the far end of the room, checking the target status board, walked over. Without a word, he took the rifle, tilted it slightly, popped the bolt, rotated his wrist, and slid the magazine free in one fluid motion. The jammed round clinked to the floor in a single crisp ting. The entire process took less than 4 seconds. The instructor next to him froze. That wasn't the by-the-book clearance method for trainees. That was the move of someone who had had to clear a weapon jam with live rounds flying overhead. Marcus handed the rifle back and walked away as if he'd done nothing more remarkable than unscrewing a bottle cap. Small moments like that began to stack up. Another time, as the team was prepping for a training dive at the dock, he glanced over a trainee's scuba kit and tapped the air valve. No one heard what he said, but that trainee immediately swapped for a new tank. The old one had a hairline crack nearly invisible to the naked eye. In the lounge one day, a few young guys were debating whether a SIG P-226 was safe to handle with a round chambered after removing the magazine. Marcus didn't join in. He simply picked up a training pistol, performed a textbook safety check, and set it back down. The soldier nearest him noticed he hadn't even looked at the gun while doing it, yet he was flawlessly accurate. Amid the banter, the sweat-drenched drills, and the endless routine, the image of the quiet, slow-moving old man began to take on another layer. Some still thought of him as Pops, the old guy who cleans the guns, but a few eyes now watched him more closely. Marcus never talked about himself. If someone asked, he'd joke lightly, "Back in the day, I only swam from the kitchen to the dining table." It drew laughs, but left behind a faint thread of doubt. The strange part was he never tried to prove anything. No showing off, no boasting, no correcting anyone unless safety was at stake, as if he was used to living in the shadow of things that couldn't be spoken. Loose pieces were beginning to form in a few minds. The EOD movements, the jam-clearing reflex, the eyes that scanned every technical detail, the instinctive focus on safety. But to complete the picture, they would need something unmistakable, and that an unmissable moment was closer than they thought. When the truth comes out, will they stay seated or stand to salute him? Take a moment, relax, and comment 1 or "I'm still here" to keep listening. That morning, a light sea mist lay over the waters of San Diego Bay, clinging to the deck of an old cargo ship moored at the pier like a thin layer of smoke. The ship's gray hull was mottled, its paint peeling, the smell of rust mixing faintly with old oil in the breeze. On paper, this was just a training set piece, a simulated hostage rescue scenario, but the setup was so elaborate it looked like a real operation. The young SEAL teams moved decisively up onto the deck, training weapons at the ready, eyes locked on their objectives. At the far end of the pier, Marcus Ellington stood alone. He wore a dark windbreaker, the brim of his cap pulled low, his hands in his pockets, looking for all the world like a casual bystander, but his eyes didn't stay still. They swept from the mooring lines to the railings, from the deck planks to the ventilation shafts, registering every small movement. Then he saw it. A vent on the ship's east side was vibrating ever so slightly, as if it were breathing fast. To the untrained eye, it could be dismissed as sea wind. But to Marcus, each tremor was a warning. The pressure inside was out of balance, a classic sign that a compartment was overloaded and about to give way. He lifted his radio, his voice low and clipped. "East side's at risk of collapse. Pull your men out." The reply crackled back, dry and irritated. "Pops, this is a simulation. Just handle your end." Marcus said nothing more. Instead of staying put as ordered, he stepped out of his observation point, lengthening his stride across the pier. His windbreaker billowed with each pace. Without pausing at the ladder, he vaulted the railing, landing softly on the main deck, then slid through a narrow passage toward the east side. Hurried footsteps pounded ahead. The SEAL team was clearing the cargo hold. Marcus didn't shout orders. He used one word, sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Out now." Something in his tone triggered instinct. 3 figures in black turned immediately, pulling back down the passage in the opposite direction. And only seconds later, the sound came a simulated bang, but with real force. The east deck buckled, a steel beam listing like a tree cut halfway through, the wire mesh flooring screeching as it collapsed into the compartment below. Had they still been standing there, at least 3 men would have been dead in today's exercise. Simulated smoke billowed, swallowing the ship's corner. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The wind carried the acrid scent of burnt paint and training smoke powder, curling around faces still etched with surprise. Marcus emerged from the haze. Unhurried, without a trace of triumph, he crossed the pier and handed the radio back to the control station. When someone asked how he'd known, he simply replied evenly, "Just heard the steel breathing." Some of the trainees glanced at each other. The steel breathing sounded both cryptic and oddly poetic. One young guy blurted, "Maybe the old man actually talks to ships." The joke drew a few laughs, but those laughs were tangled with another kind of silence, the silence of people who had just witnessed something they couldn't explain. Lieutenant Coleman stood on the upper deck, training scenario binder still in hand. The plan hadn't called for an east side collapse. He knew the ship had been inspected for safety before the drill. But a rusted-out compartment below, more corroded than expected, had given way under the weight of the team moving in all at once. Coleman noted one thing. The old man had spotted a danger every one of them had missed. The incident rippled through the base like small waves across still water. No one whistled anymore when Marcus passed. There were no apologies, but the looks carried less scorn. He still reported to the workshop as always, still cleaned the weapons and honed the knives, still kept to the sidelines. But now a few new eyes had begun to watch what he did and, more importantly, to listen when he spoke, even if it was only a sentence. For most, it was just an odd moment in a training drill. But for some, it was the first time they asked themselves, who exactly is this man? And if he could hear the steel breathing, what else could he hear that they had never even noticed? The next morning, with sea mist still clinging to the steel railings, Marcus was invited to the command office. The base commander sat behind his desk, his eyes sharp but carrying a new measure of respect. He spoke slowly. "You just saved their whole team. How did you spot it?" Marcus stood straight, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his gaze neither avoiding nor seeking. "Fallujah 2004. A ship's compartment collapsed because we ignored a vibration like that. 22 dead." The room fell silent. The commander nodded, asking no further questions. Some stories don't need to be told in full. Those with the experience will understand. Rumors spread like whitecaps on open water. A few younger sailors began to look at Marcus differently, though most still didn't believe. "He could be making it up," someone muttered in the lounge. "Old guys love to exaggerate." Then, at that week's all-hands meeting, the commander abruptly cut into the routine announcements. He turned his gaze toward the corner of the room, where Marcus sat quietly, his cap brim shading half his face. "Pops, show them." Marcus didn't ask, "Show them what?" He only gave a small nod, stood, and stepped out of the room for a few seconds. When he returned, he carried a dark wooden box, smoothed by years of handling. He set it on the table in the center of the room. The lid opened, and the room seemed to freeze. Inside, the bronze gleam of a bronze star with a combat V caught the light. Beside it, a blue star medallion rimmed in gold, with 13 white stars, the Medal of Honor of the United States. Several young sailors leaned forward, as if to confirm what they were seeing wasn't a replica. The air grew heavy. This was no longer just Pops. The man who cleaned guns in the workshop before them stood a living fragment of U.S. military history. Marcus didn't lift them to display. He left them lying in the box and began to speak, his voice steady, like reading a report in which every word still carried its own weight. Somalia, 1,993. Off the coast of Kismayo. Mission: rescue a captured CIA operative from a fishing vessel and protect national security. Late intel confirmed the vessel had been rigged with 19 chain mines around the hull. The crew had been executed. Time until detonation, less than 1 hour. Marcus, then a member of SEAL Team 8 Night Rough Seas. They approached in a lightless RIB, the only illumination the faint glow of dive watches. He was first into the water. Mission: disable the mines before the assault team boarded. Under AK fire from the deck, he followed each connecting wire, disarming each trigger. At the 14th mine, an unexpected blast hurled him back, the surge shredding visibility. 3 ribs broken, ears ringing. Many would take that as the signal to pull out. Marcus went back. There were still 5 mines and still a hostage. He disarmed the last one with just over 2 minutes of air left on his dive gauge. When they withdrew, the ship slipped beneath the night sea, but not a single mine detonated. The hostage lived. Marcus closed the story with one short sentence: "This star isn't for showing off. It's for remembering every face I couldn't save." No one spoke. Even the ceiling fans seemed louder than usual. One young sailor, who had often mocked him, stared down at the floor. Another glanced at Marcus, as if about to say something, but swallowed it back. They weren't just looking at medals, they were seeing the cost of earning them. In the corner, a faint smile crossed the commander's face. Marcus simply closed the box and carried it back to where it belonged. At the doorway, he paused for a beat, glanced back as if to say something, then didn't. If what he'd told them was only part of the story, what would the rest look like? My dear viewers, stay tuned for the next part that will leave you in awe. Take a second to like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see people joining us from all around the world. Since the day the wooden box was opened, it felt as if a different wind had blown through the base. Eyes that once passed over Marcus without leaving a trace now lingered longer. No one whistled at him when he walked past the workshop anymore, and no one stepped aside to avoid him. The silence was no longer distance, it was listening. Lieutenant Coleman changed the most. At the Monday morning briefing, he volunteered, "Pops, you take this week's training, mine detection and night diving." Marcus looked at him for a few seconds, then nodded. No further words. The first session took place on a gray afternoon, the clouds hanging low as if pressing down on the water. The young SEAL teams gathered at dock, wetsuits and masks ready. Marcus wore no heavy gear, just a waterproof jacket and rubber boots. He didn't begin with a lecture or a list of dry statistics. He bent down, tapping lightly on a steel beam along the ship's side. The sound that came out was low and hollow. Hear that? Steel breathes too. When it's tired, when it's under pressure, it changes its voice. Not everyone can hear it. But if you want to survive, you have to learn. He pointed toward the water around the ship, where weak light spilled down. When there's a chemical leak, the water changes color. It's not always a clear stain. Sometimes it's just a thin, smoky shimmer. Don't trust your eyes more than your ears and your nose. Marcus told a short story about an operation off the coast of Yemen when he and his team stopped mid-route simply because they smelled burnt metal in the water. That decision saved them from a chemical storage compartment with a broken valve. He spoke as if tasting the salty water that day again, without embellishment or dramatics. Throughout the session, he didn't shout or bark orders. He stood by the ship's side, guiding and letting each person try for themselves. When a recruit wore his mask wrong, Marcus simply reached over to adjust it, accompanied by a wry frown. If you wear it like this out at sea, you'll see the fish laugh before you do. Laughter broke out, then quickly quieted so they could hear more. Then came the night dive. The sun was gone, the water dark, lit only by a few dim dock lamps. Marcus handed each person a dive torch, but warned them first, don't trust the light too much. Sometimes you see more when it's off. He led them into the water, every movement slow and certain. Once they were all submerged, he signaled to switch off the lights. The darkness thickened like ink. A few held their breath instinctively. In that blackness, he used his hands to point out sounds, the rush of water through a narrow gap, the faint vibration of metal far away. Then he explained, these were signs of a compartment losing pressure, or of an obstruction shifting with the current, things the eyes can't see but the ears and the body can feel. When they surfaced, a young petty officer, blond-haired with the freshness of a newcomer still in his face, hesitated before asking, why do you still go back to the sea? After everything? Marcus looked out over the rippling water, his eyes not entirely in the present. The sea took my friends, he said, a faint smile crossing his lips. But it also taught me how to save others. No one added another word. Only the sound of waves and the smell of salt remained. From that day, every training session with Marcus was full. Not because of an order from command, but because no one wanted to miss them. Every sentence he spoke, every movement he made, carried within it years most of them only knew from books. And slowly, the respect they held no longer came from the medals in the wooden box, but from the flesh and blood man standing before them. But what few knew was that Marcus still kept another memento, one he had never shown anyone, and soon it would appear in a way no one could have expected. 3 months had passed since the day the wooden box was open. Summer in Coronado was over, the sea breeze turning colder, but inside the barracks, the atmosphere had warmed in a different way. Marcus still did the same familiar tasks, cleaning guns, sharpening knives, adjusting every air valve. The difference now was that when he walked into the workshop, young eyes looked up to greet him, and sometimes a question would be tossed out just to hear him tell a story. News of joint training at Naval Station Norfolk came on a misty morning. It was one of the largest naval bases in the United States, gathering elite units from both the East and West coasts. Coleman's young SEAL team was chosen to participate, and this time, Marcus's name appeared officially on the roster. Not as a technical volunteer, but as special advisor. On their last day in Coronado before departure, everyone gathered in the technical warehouse. On the wooden table in the center of the room lay a small box wrapped in craft paper. Coleman stood beside it, arms crossed, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "Pops, we've got something for you." Marcus opened it. Inside was his old steel mug, the same one he'd brought on his first day, the one that had clattered noisily to the floor, drawing laughter from a few recruits. But now neatly engraved on its side were the words, "He listened to the steel breathe, and we listened to him." Marcus held the mug in his hand, turning it slowly so the light glinted off the steel surface. He didn't speak right away. He just gave it a light squeeze, as if afraid it might vanish. Then a faint smile crossed his face, the rare kind, not born entirely from joy, but from the feeling of being understood. A few whistles rose from the corner of the room, then quickly faded. No one wanted to break the moment. Marcus's eyes turned toward the door, where the sea breeze drifted in, carrying the scent of salt and the sound of waves. It was still the same blue water, the one that had once swallowed his friends and left him with sleepless nights. But today, it was no longer just a memory of loss. It was a promise that his experience, blood and sweat, would live on in the footsteps of these young men. That afternoon, Marcus returned alone to the pier. He set the steel mug on the railing, filled it from a bottle, and sat down on the old wooden bench to look out to sea. The late-day sun stained the water a bronze red, the same hue as the bronze star resting quietly in the wooden box at home. He remembered the first time he set foot on the deck of a ship as a young sailor, not in America, but half a world away. Back then, everything dangerous and new blurred together, and the steel breathing was something he didn't yet understand. Now, it was part of his very blood, and more importantly, something he could pass on. From a distance, footsteps echoed on the pier. Coleman approached, not in uniform, but in a hoodie and a baseball cap. He stood beside Marcus for a few seconds, then nodded without speaking. Marcus didn't need him to. Some things don't require words to be understood. The sky darkened. The harbor lights flicked on, their golden glow spilling across the water. Marcus stood, picked up the mug, and tapped its base lightly against the railing, a low, resonant sound far different from the harsh clatter of his first day. Perhaps the steel was as at peace as he was. As he walked away from the pier, he turned for one last look. The sea was still there, vast and deep, but this time he wasn't turning his back out of fear of losing anyone else. He turned away knowing he'd left behind enough for them to survive on their own and to keep listening to the steel breathe. The warehouse door closed behind him, the hinges giving a soft creak. The mug was placed back on the table, no longer with a cold metallic ring, but with a soft, contained sound like the final period at the end of a long chapter. But for the team, Marcus's story wasn't over. They would carry it out to sea, so that whenever they heard the faint vibration in steel, they would remember him. And perhaps, somewhere, Marcus would smile knowing they did. Some people pass their lives quietly, leaving their mark not with boasts, but with the way they live, what they give, and the wounds they keep to themselves. Marcus Ellington never sought the spotlight, but the light of his integrity had guided an entire generation. This story reminds us, experience, courage, and humility are values that never go out of date. And sometimes, all it takes is for us to listen to the steel breathing, or to the heartbeat of those who came before to learn how to walk more firmly through life. If Marcus's story has touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so more Americans know that the real heroes are still among us, though they're humble enough to be overlooked. And who knows, somewhere out there, someone may also be quietly listening, waiting for their turn to pass on the lessons of a life well lived.